What is up, gang? Today is day 24, Brush Record 30. It's not actually day 24. I think it's something more like day 30 or 31 at this point. But, I've had a little bit of travel back and forth, and I'm trying to just stay consistent enough to get to 30 days of videos. So when I say day 24, it isn't day 24 on the calendar. But it's day 24 of Press Record 30, and it's all about how quickly you can get to 30 videos to try to establish a habit of getting these videos out. But I've been traveling a little bit, went and saw some family, so took a little break for a few days, but I'm back at day 24, and today I want to talk about the last meditations of Anthony de Mello. Specifically, there's this little book called A Way to Love. Anthony de Mello came into my life in a book he wrote called Awareness. Awareness is, I think it's the Quake book that Tim Ferriss cites as one that fundamentally changed his outlook on life and how he views things. I read Awareness first and then fell in love with Anthony de Mello's writing, and then went to Way to Love, which has since become my preference over Awareness even. And in The Way to Love, it's 13, 14, more than that, 20, 25. Meditate, you can see it. And then they're just sort of 5-page meditations on certain topics. As like a continuation of Awareness, a lot of what Anthony de Mello talks about is the awareness of the fact of awareness of how much your attachment to things is the cause of suffering, and how attachment and our attachment to things, whether it's people or objects or pursuits, those things that we don't want to give up are the things that are the very source of our suffering. So there are a few different places in this book where he talks about that specifically, and I just want to go through a few. So how he does each of these chapters is he quotes a verse from the Bible, and then he has a 4 or 5 page meditation on that theme. So starting with this idea of attachment and attachment as a source of suffering, one of the verses that has come to encapsulate that concept or idea to me is this. It's Mark 10:25, and it says, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And this is also where he defines attachment. He says, now if you look carefully, you will see that there is one thing and only one thing that causes unhappiness. The name of that thing is attachment. What is an attachment? An emotional state of clinging caused by the belief that without some particular thing or person, you cannot be happy. Later, he continues, so an attachment by its very nature makes you vulnerable to emotional turmoil and is always threatening to shatter your peace. So how can you expect an attached person to enter that ocean of happiness called the kingdom of God? As well expect a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Then he asks later, as if from the position of somebody asked to give up their attachments. Can't I keep just one attachment? Of course, you can keep as many as you want, but for each attachment, you pay a price in lost happiness. And then he ends this chapter, the rich man cannot enter the kingdom of joy, not because he wants to be bad, but because he chooses to be blind. My reflection on this is he cannot rise to paradise because he chooses to be weighed down by the things of the world. That's sort of one of the main themes of this book, A Way to Love. Another one of the main themes is around this idea of programming, or how we learn to view the world through a lens that we pick up from our teachers, our preachers, and our parents in our education. This is also a main theme of Plato's Cave, which we've touched on previously in these series of videos. De Mello uses a different variation to tell something like Plato's cave. And it reminds me of C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce and the idea of this bus and getting on a bus. And so I actually think I like this image more for the modern person than Plato's cave, per se, to illustrate this idea of how our perception of the world is given to us secondhand. And a lot of what enlightenment is learning to see the world for ourselves. And the image that Anthony de Mello uses in Way to Love comes in a chapter called One Teacher. And he says, imagine a group of tourists in a bus. The shades of that bus are down, and they don't see or hear or touch or smell a single thing from the strange exotic country that they are passing through. While all the while their guide chatters away, giving them what he thinks is a vivid description of the smells, sounds, and sights of the world outside. The only things that they, meaning the people on the bus, will experience are the images that his words create in their heads. Let's suppose that the bus stops and he sends them forth with formulas about what they can expect to see and experience. Their experience will be contaminated, conditioned, distorted by these formulas, and they will perceive not reality itself, but reality is filtered through the guide's formulas. Now, this isn't an exact analog of Plato's allegory of the cave, which imagines prisoners chained, looking at a cave wall, seeing shadows based on projections of a fire behind them that are cast by something called image makers. And they cannot turn their head to see the image maker, so they grow up believing that the shadows on this wall are reality itself. Plato likens the condition of man, to this type of person who must learn to turn his head, see first the image makers who are manipulating reality, and then pass beyond the image makers out of the cave, eventually to view sun, which is reality or source of life, or the good itself. That is this idea of Plato's cave. Now, in de Mello's version, where we find passengers on a bus with the shades pulled down, who are only delivered secondhand accounts of reality outside the bus by their guide, by the bus driver, until eventually they get off the bus. And when they get off the bus, they encounter reality, sort of with the idea that the guide had put in their head first. So it's not, they're never in a situation where they're seeing the world as it is. They're seeing the world as they are. And the way that they are is determined by the instructions, directions, and guidance that they were given by the bus driver. So they're sort of robbed of this ability to encounter it as children with fresh eyes. And I think that's a relatively accurate description of programming education and what we're taught in the early years of our life before we can see things for ourselves. This is why so much of middle-aged life revolves around this idea of deprogramming and examining. This is the idea of the examined life is the only one worth living, because it's the only one that's actually yours. Because until we take the time to think about, examine, reconsider, bound, Lincoln says, until I have bound it west and east and north and south, you cannot trust an idea until you've looked at it thoroughly, looked carefully into it, and decided whether it is real and worth keeping in your belief, or whether it's just something, an inherited script that was passed on to you. Until you make that decision, you cannot know if what you believe is actually what you believe, or if it's just the default way of operating the world based on what you were told. And so it's a good heuristic, a good mental model to think about, is that we all, I'm not going to say handicapped, because I want to be, I'm not trying to claim that this is on par with folks who have physical handicaps, but to an extent, we all have a mental handicap. By the time that we are acting for ourselves in the world, we have this mental handicap, whether we recognize it or not, that the world as we see it and encounter it is colored by the experiences of everybody else that poured into us when we were young. And so until we take that time to examine those beliefs and what those things have caused us to become attached to in the world, we will never get at the root of what makes us so consistently unhappy. This is why it remains the project of your life to examine these things. Now, the last portion of this book that sort of brings this point home is the idea of become like children. This comes from Matthew 18:3. Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of God. And then he ends this chapter with this reflection, which is how I'll end this video. Think of this. The reason why the child is able to preserve its innocence and live like the rest of creation in the bliss of the kingdom is that it has not been sucked into what we call the world. That region of darkness inhabited by grown-ups whose lives are spent not in living but in courting applause and admiration. Not in blissfully being themselves but in neurotically comparing and competing. Striving for those empty things called success and fame, even if they can only be attained at the expense of defeating, humiliating, destroying their neighbors. If you allow yourself to really feel the pains of this hell on earth, the utter emptiness it brings, you might experience within you a revolt. A disgust so powerful that it will shatter the chains of dependence and deceit that have been forged around your soul, and you will break loose into the kingdom of innocence, where mystics and children dwell. Until next time, peace.